Beginning in 1849 in the ruins of an Assyrian palace buried beneath the sands of northern Iraq, a man named Austin Henry Layard, and later his assistant Hormuzd Rassam, pulled thousands of clay tablets from the earth that had not been touched by human hands in over 2,500 years. Many were the size of a small paperback. They were covered in wedge-shaped marks pressed into the clay while it was still wet, some dating to around the 17th century before Christ or earlier. And when scholars finally deciphered what those marks said, decades later, in a back room of the British Museum, they found something that should not have been there. A step-by-step account of how human beings were made. Not born, not evolved. Made. Engineered from an existing creature by beings who understood the code of life, and who, based on what the texts describe, appear to have deliberately limited several specific capabilities in the result. That was 1849. In 2003, the Human Genome Project declared the human genome essentially complete. Over 3 billion base pairs of genetic code mapped and sequenced. And what they found was this. Roughly 98% of your genome does not code for proteins. It does not, according to the models of the time, do anything at all. They called it junk. They set it aside. And for a decade, that is exactly where it stayed. It was not until the ENCODE project, more than 400 scientists, 32 laboratories, 6 countries, detected biochemical activity across at least 80% of that so-called junk, that anyone began to realize the scale of the oversight. The junk was not junk. It was a control room, a vast library of instructions, most of them switched off. 2 sets of evidence 4,000 years apart, one carved in cuneiform on river clay, the other sequenced in a laboratory by machines that can read a single molecule, both pointing in their own language toward the same unsettling possibility, a human being carrying an immense hidden architecture of silence potential. Tonight, we are going to walk through 7 themes that emerge from those ancient texts. 7 areas where human potential appears to have been deliberately constrained, one by one, tablet by tablet, gene by gene. We are going to lay the oldest written records on Earth beside the newest findings in molecular biology, and ask a question that neither field has been willing to ask alone. What if they are telling the same story? This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a pattern, a convergence between the oldest written records on Earth and the newest frontier of molecular biology. It may be a conversation across 4 millennia, conducted in 2 different languages, cuneiform and biochemistry, that arrives at a remarkably similar observation. Something in us appears to have been limited, something specific, something that we are only now developing the tools to understand. But there is no hurry, not tonight. If you're lying in the dark right now, if the world has been loud today and you came here for something quieter, then you are in the right place. Let your eyes close if they want to. Let your breathing slow. The story will carry you. You do not need to remember every detail. You do not need to stay awake for every word. Just let it wash over you, the way water moves over ancient stone, slowly, patiently, wearing a path deeper with every pass. We have all night, and this story has waited 4,000 years. It can wait a little longer for you to get comfortable. To understand what may have been taken from us, we first need to understand what is already inside us, hiding in plain sight. In the early 1970s, a geneticist named Susumu Ono popularized the term junk DNA in a landmark 1972 paper. The idea was straightforward. If a segment of DNA did not code for a protein, it was evolutionary debris, leftovers from viral infections, broken copies of ancient genes that no longer functioned. Genetic noise accumulated over millions of years of evolution. For decades, this was the dominant view. The 1 to 2% of the genome that coded for proteins was considered the meaningful part. Everything else was treated as irrelevant filler. Graduate students were told not to waste their time studying it. Research grants were not awarded for investigating sequences that had been officially declared useless. The assumptions seemed reasonable at first glance. About half of the human genome is made up of transposable elements, so-called jumping genes that have copied and pasted themselves throughout the genome over evolutionary time. Another 5% consists of pseudogenes, broken relics of once functional genes. The rest was a patchwork of repetitive sequences, satellite DNA, and mysterious stretches of code that seemed to serve no discernible purpose. Then came the ENCODE project, launched in 2003 and publishing its first major results in 2012, The Encyclopedia of DNA Elements set out to catalogue every functional element in the human genome. The team included over 400 scientists from 32 laboratories across 6 countries. They performed more than 1,600 sets of experiments on 147 cell types, mapping where proteins bind, where RNA is transcribed, and where chemical modifications occur. The findings sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Researchers detected biochemical activity across at least 80% of the genome. That did not necessarily mean all of it was functional in the traditional sense. That debate continues fiercely, with some scientists arguing that at most 10 to 15% is truly functional. But it meant that the vast non-coding regions of your DNA were doing far more than gathering dust. Non-coding DNA, it turns out, is not silent at all. It is whispering constantly. Some of it contains regulatory sequences, molecular switches that determine when a gene turns on, when it turns off, and how loudly it speaks. Think of it this way. If your protein-coding genes are the instruments in an orchestra, the non-coding DNA is the conductor. It does not play a single note, but without it, the music is chaos. Other stretches of non-coding DNA contain instructions for building tiny RNA molecules, not proteins, but regulators of proteins. Molecular editors that can intercept a genetic message before it is read, silence it, amplify it, or redirect it entirely. These regulators number in the thousands, and many of them are derived from the very regions of the genome that were once dismissed as garbage. And perhaps most remarkably, non-coding DNA shapes how your genome folds in 3-dimensional space inside the nucleus of every cell. Your DNA is not a flat string. It is an origami sculpture, folded into loops and domains that determine which genes are accessible and which are physically buried. Change the folding, and you change which programs can run, even if the underlying code stays exactly the same. Researchers at Stanford found that repetitive sequences once considered meaningless directly influence how the cell's reading machinery attaches to DNA. Scientists at MIT discovered that satellite DNA, the category most confidently labelled as useless, plays an essential role in holding chromosomes together during cell division. Without it, cells fall apart. In other words, the so-called junk was not junk at all. It was the control room, the operating system, the silent hand that determines which programs run and which remain dormant. And that word, dormant, is where this story gets truly interesting. In the last 2 decades, a field called epigenetics has revealed something extraordinary about human biology. Your genes are not fixed instructions that run the same way from birth to death. They can be turned on and off, silenced or activated. And the mechanisms that control this switching do not alter the DNA sequence itself. They operate above it, like a layer of software running on top of the hardware. The Greek prefix "ep" means above or upon. Epigenetics literally means above the genome. It is the study of how gene expression changes without any change to the underlying DNA sequence, and its implications for understanding human potential are staggering. The most well-understood mechanism is DNA methylation. Picture a tiny chemical tag, just 1 carbon atom bonded to 3 hydrogen atoms, landing on a section of your DNA like a padlock snapping shut on a gate. When that tag attaches to the entrance of a gene, the gene goes quiet. The information is still there. Every letter of code remains intact, but the cell can no longer read it. The book is on the shelf, the cover is sealed. Now picture a different mechanism. Your DNA does not float freely inside your cells. It wraps tightly around proteins called histones. Imagine thread wound around millions of tiny spools. When those spools are chemically modified, the tightness of the wrapping changes. Loosen the spool, and the DNA uncoils. The gene becomes readable, accessible, alive. Tighten it, and the DNA compacts so densely that nothing can reach it. The information is buried, not erased, buried. There is a third mechanism, and this one is perhaps the strangest. Your non-coding DNA produces tiny RNA molecules that act as editors. They intercept genetic messages mid-delivery and prevent them from being translated into proteins. Imagine a letter being written, sealed and sent, and then intercepted by a sensor before it reaches its destination. The letter exists. The message was composed, but it was never read. These RNA editors number in the thousands, and many of them are produced by the very regions of the genome that science once threw away. The implications are profound. genes can be silenced not because they are broken, but because something shut them off. And here is the critical point. Those silencing marks can be reversed. Epigenetic modifications are, by their very nature, reversible. This is one of the key differences between genetics and epigenetics. A genetic mutation changes the DNA sequence permanently. An epigenetic modification sits on top of an intact sequence and can be removed. Scientists have already demonstrated this in the laboratory. There are drugs, already in clinical use for certain forms of leukemia, that can strip away those methyl tags and reactivate genes that had been silenced for generations. Other drugs can loosen the histone spools and expose genes that were buried. In cancer patients, tumour suppressor genes that had been epigenetically shut down can be switched back on. The cell remembers what it was supposed to do. The program restarts. What this means, in the plainest possible terms, is that your DNA contains capabilities that are currently switched off, and the switches can, in principle, be flipped back on. These epigenetic modifications can be influenced by diet, stress, environmental toxins, sleep patterns, exercise, meditation, and even emotional experience. A study on Dutch famine survivors from World War II found that children conceived during the famine carried specific epigenetic marks on their DNA, marks that affected their health outcomes 60 years later. Trauma, in other words, writes itself into the genome, and so does healing. The question that no one in mainstream science has been willing to ask, at least not publicly, is this: who flipped those switches in the first place? Evolution would say that these genes were silenced gradually, over millions of years, because they no longer provided a survival advantage. Random mutation, natural selection, genetic drift. But the Sumerian tablets offer a very different answer. Long before the Greeks wrote the Iliad, before the Hebrews composed Genesis, before the Egyptians carved their first hieroglyphs into temple walls, the Sumerians pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay and created something the world had never seen: written language, and with it, the first recorded stories of creation. Sumer emerged in the alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now southern Iraq, sometime around 4500 BCE. Within 2,000 years, this civilization had invented the wheel, the plough, the sailboat, irrigation agriculture, codified law, a sexagesimal mathematical system that still gives us 60 minutes in an hour and 360 degrees in a circle, and the most sophisticated astronomy the ancient world had ever seen. But of all their inventions, the most consequential was writing. Cuneiform, from the Latin cunus, meaning wedge, began as pictographic symbols scratched into soft clay tablets. Over centuries it evolved into an abstract system of wedge-shaped impressions made with a reed stylus. It could express anything: contracts, letters, hymns, medical prescriptions, legal codes, astronomical observations, and, critically, creation myths. The Atrahasis epic, dating to approximately 1700 BCE in its oldest surviving copy, but referencing traditions far older, describes the world before humanity existed. In this account, the universe is already populated by gods, an organised pantheon with a clear hierarchy. At the top sits Anu, the sky god, the supreme authority. Beneath him, two brothers divide the world: Enlil, lord of the earth and atmosphere, and Enki, lord of the freshwater abyss and keeper of knowledge. But the gods are not at peace. The lower-ranking deities, called the Agigi, have been assigned the backbreaking work of digging canals, irrigating fields, and maintaining the infrastructure of the divine realm, and after what the tablets describe as ages of unrelenting labour, they revolt. Imagine the scene as the tablets paint it: the night sky over Mesopotamia, the silhouette of Enlil's dwelling, and at the gate a crowd of gods, lesser gods, working gods, gods with dirt under their fingernails, holding fire in their hands. They have burned their tools. They surround the house. They refuse to work another day. This is not a metaphor. The tablets describe it as a labour strike, a collective uprising of the lower gods against the ruling class. Enlil is enraged and wants to punish them. But Enki intervenes with a different solution. He proposes creating a new being, a worker, a creature intelligent enough to follow instructions but limited enough to remain controllable, something that can dig the canals, till the fields, and serve the temples, so that the gods never have to do it again. The goddess Nintu, also called Ninhursag, Mami, or Beletili, the mother goddess, is tasked with the creation, but she does not create from nothing. The tablets are explicit. She takes an existing creature and modifies it. Using the blood and flesh of a slain god named Geshtui, also called Wi'ilu in some versions, whose name translates to the god who has intelligence, she mixes divine essence with the clay of the earth. The text is specific about the mixing process. The clay is prepared, the divine blood is added, the mixture is shaped, and then, in a detail that is often overlooked, a spirit is imposed upon the result. The Sumerian word is etemu, the ghost or spirit of the slain god, which passes into the new creation. In this way, the new being inherits something of the intelligence of the divine encoded in the blood. But, and this is a crucial distinction, the full divine capability is not granted, only enough to serve the purpose. The creation accounts also describe multiple attempts. In the Atrahasis, 14 pieces of clay are pinched off, 7 for male forms, 7 for female, and shaped with the divine mixture. A separate but related text, known as Enki and Ninmah, describes a scene in which Enki and the mother goddess, after drinking beer, engage in a contest of creation, and produce a series of beings with severe functional deficits. One cannot close its hands, another cannot hold urine, one cannot eat bread, another cannot stand upright. These are described not as metaphysical errors, but as concrete biological malfunctions. Whether these represent early experiments in the creation process or a separate mythological episode is debated by scholars, but the image they present is consistent. Creation as an iterative, imperfect process, not a single divine act, but something closer to experimentation. And at the end of that process, what emerges is the Lulu, the mixed one, the primitive worker, a being that is part divine and part earthly, but deliberately, intentionally reduced. To understand why humanity was limited, you need to understand the politics of the gods. In the Sumerian pantheon, power is not a simple hierarchy. It is a triangle of tension. Anu, the father, rules from the heavens but rarely intervenes directly. He is the ultimate authority, the chairman of the board, but the day-to-day management of earth is delegated to his sons. Enlil, the firstborn, holds executive authority over the earth. He is the enforcer, the lawgiver, the one who controls the winds and storms and the fate of civilizations. In the texts, Enlil is consistently portrayed as stern, authoritarian, and deeply suspicious of humanity. He views the new human creation not as a miracle but as a potential threat, a tool that might one day turn on its makers. Then there is Enki, the younger brother, the scientist, the trickster, the keeper of the ME, those mysterious tablets or objects that contain the fundamental knowledge of civilization, from agriculture to medicine to the secrets of the cosmos. Enki is the architect of humanity. He designed us. He mixed the divine blood with the earth and clay, and in nearly every text where he appears, he is the one who tries to protect us from the wrath of his brother. This tension between Enlil and Enki is the central drama of Mesopotamian mythology. It is the engine that drives every major narrative. Enlil wants humanity controlled, contained, reduced. He sees us as tools, useful but dangerous if left unchecked. When humanity grows too numerous and too noisy, the term used in the tablets is hubru, an overwhelming clamour. It is Enlil who sends plagues, droughts, and ultimately the great flood to destroy us. And it is always Enki who intervenes, who warns the faithful priest Atrahasis of the coming flood, who whispers through a reed wall so as not to technically break his oath of silence, who ensures that humanity survives, again and again, despite the will of the ruling authority. But even Enki, the protector, participates in the original limitation, because the Council of Gods demands it. The creation must serve its purpose. Humanity must be useful but not equal, strong enough to labour but not strong enough to challenge the divine order. And so, according to the tablets, certain traits are stripped away, certain capacities are removed from the prototype, not deleted. The genetic material, the divine blood is still present, but silenced, suppressed, made dormant. 7 themes in particular emerge when we read across the combined corpus of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian creation texts. These are not listed as a numbered catalogue in any single tablet. Rather, they are patterns that surface across multiple texts, when the creation narratives are read together. 7 areas where the original being appears to have possessed full capability, and where the Lulu, the hybrid worker, was given something less. Let us begin with the first. Trait 1, the lifespan. The shortening of the biological clock. The Sumerian king list is one of the most puzzling documents in the history of civilization. The most complete surviving copy is inscribed on a 4-sided clay prism, roughly 20 centimeters tall and 9 centimeters wide, perforated through the center so it could be mounted on a wooden spindle and rotated to read all 4 faces. It is known as the Weld-Blundell prism, after the British collector who acquired it following its discovery at the site of ancient Larsa around 1922. It now sits in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, catalogue number AN1923.444. Each of its 4 faces carries 2 columns of cuneiform text recording the Sumerian language, and what that text describes has challenged scholars for over a century. The list begins with a line that has echoed through 4,000 years of scholarship. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, and the kings who follow are credited with reigns that defy comprehension. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, is said to have reigned for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalga, ruled for 36,000 years. Enmenlu-Ana of Bad Tibera reigned for 43,200 years. Across 5 cities and 8 kings, the total duration of kingship before the flood is recorded as 241,200 years. The numbers are measured in sars, units of 3,600, reflecting the Sumerian sexagesimal mathematical system. Whether these figures represent literal years, symbolic epochs, or some form of encoded astronomical data remains one of the great open questions of ancient history. But the pattern they describe is unambiguous. After the flood, a dramatic change occurs. The text reads, "After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish, and the reign lengths plummet. The first post-flood dynasty of Kish lists 23 kings whose reigns, though still extraordinary by modern standards, range from 300 to 1,500 years. Then the numbers continue to drop. Hundreds of years, then decades, then finally spans that align with ordinary human lifetimes. The same pattern appears in the Hebrew Bible. The antediluvian patriarchs live for centuries, Adam for 930 years, Methuselah for 969, Noah for 950. After the flood, lifespans decline sharply. Abraham lives to 175, Moses to 120, and God specifically declares a new limit. "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. Mainstream archaeology treats the Sumerian numbers as symbolic, perhaps representing dynasties rather than individuals, or using a numerical system that inflates the figures for political purposes to establish the antiquity and prestige of a ruling line. And those are reasonable interpretations. But the pattern itself, the idea that human lifespans were once far longer and were then deliberately shortened, is so deeply embedded in the oldest written records on Earth that dismissing it entirely requires ignoring a remarkable convergence of independent traditions. Because modern biology has uncovered something eerily parallel. At the tip of every chromosome in your body sits a structure called a telomere, a repetitive sequence of DNA, specifically the 6-nucleotide pattern TTAGGG, repeated thousands of times. Telomeres function like the plastic cap on a shoelace, protecting the chromosome from fraying during cell division. Every time a cell divides, the telomeres shorten slightly, by roughly 50 to 70 base pairs per division. When they reach a critical minimum length, what researchers have called the telomeric brink, approximately 5 kilobases, the cell can no longer divide. It enters senescence or dies. This is, in the most literal sense, a biological clock, a countdown built into the architecture of your cells, and the rate at which it ticks determines, in large part, how long you live. Researchers have measured telomere shortening rates across species, and the pattern is striking. In mice, telomeres shorten at roughly 7,000 base pairs per year, and mice live about 2 years. In humans, the rate is about 70 base pairs per year, and we live to roughly 80. The slower the clock ticks, the longer the organism lasts. Study after study has confirmed this relationship across birds, mammals and reptiles. When you are born, your telomeres are long, somewhere between 8 and 13 kilobases. By the time you reach 60, they have worn down to roughly 5 or 6. That is the threshold, the brink. Below it, cells begin to fail, but here is what makes this relevant to our story. The enzyme telomerase can rebuild telomeres. It is already present in your genome. Every cell in your body carries the gene for telomerase, specifically the TERT gene, which encodes the catalytic component of the enzyme. But in the vast majority of your somatic cells, that gene is silenced, epigenetically switched off. It remains active only in stem cells, germ cells, and certain immune cells, the cells that need to keep dividing. Your body possesses the blueprint for an enzyme that could, in theory, dramatically extend cell division, and therefore lifespan, but something in your genetic programming has shut it down across most tissue types. In cancer cells, TERT reactivates spontaneously. Upregulated telomerase activity is observed in over 70% of cancers. The telomeres rebuild. The cells become, in a sense, immortal. They divide indefinitely. This is destructive in the context of cancer, obviously, but it proves the machinery exists. The gene works. It has simply been turned off in healthy tissue. People with a condition called dyskeratosis congenita experience accelerated telomere shortening and suffer premature aging, grey hair, bone deterioration, organ fibrosis, immune collapse. Their condition demonstrates in reverse what telomere length means for longevity. Meanwhile, researchers at Johns Hopkins have studied families with unusually long telomeres and found that while they showed delayed signs of aging, such as retaining hair colour into their 70s, the relationship between telomere length and health proved more complex than expected. Now recall what the Atrahasis epic describes. After the flood, when Enlil realizes that humanity has survived, he decrees that human lifespans will be limited. The texts describe the establishment of mortality and infant death as deliberate measures. The biological clock, if we are reading this correctly, was set, not by evolution, not by random mutation, but by decree. The Sumerian tablets say the gods shortened human life. Modern biology shows that the gene responsible for extending it is present but epigenetically silenced. Whether these represent two different languages describing the same phenomenon separated by 4,000 years is a question worth sitting with. If that parallel does not make you pause, nothing will. Trait 2. The perception. The dimming of expanded awareness. Deep within the centre of your brain, nestled between the two hemispheres, sits a structure no larger than a grain of rice. It is called the pineal gland, and for something so small, it has attracted an extraordinary amount of attention throughout human history. Some researchers have noted a visual resemblance between a cross-section of the pineal gland region of the brain and the ancient Egyptian Eye of Horus, though mainstream Egyptologists generally interpret the Eye of Horus as a symbol of protection and healing, rather than a direct anatomical reference. Hindu traditions describe the Ajna chakra, the third eye, located precisely where the pineal gland sits, associated with intuition, insight, and access to higher states of consciousness. The Greek physician Galen wrote about it in the 2nd century, noting its singular unpaired structure in the brain. Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, called it the seat of the soul, the point where the immaterial mind interacts with the material body. Modern neuroscience tells us that the pineal gland produces melatonin, the hormone that regulates your sleep-wake cycle, but that is only the beginning. The pineal gland also contains photoreceptor cells remarkably similar to those found in the retina of the eye, cells that are sensitive to light. In many reptiles and amphibians, the pineal gland is literally a third eye, a parietal eye with a lens and a retina located on the top of the skull, capable of detecting light directly through the bone. In Tuatara lizards, ancient reptiles that have changed little in over 200 million years, this parietal eye is clearly visible as a translucent scale on the top of the head. It does not form images the way your eyes do, but it detects changes in light intensity and wavelength, playing a critical role in circadian rhythm regulation and seasonal behaviour. In humans, this structure has been internalized. It no longer sits on the surface. But the cellular machinery is still there. The genes that code for the light-sensing proteins, the opsins and phototransduction enzymes, are still in your DNA. They are expressed at low levels in the pineal gland, a vestige of a sensory system that was once far more active. And the pineal gland does something else, something that mainstream science has only recently begun to take seriously. In 2019, a research team led by Jim O'Borgigan at the University of Michigan made a discovery that raised more questions than it answered. They demonstrated that the mammalian brain, in rats, is capable of producing dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, not just in the pineal gland but throughout the brain, in the neocortex, in the hippocampus. The enzymes required to synthesize it were found in the same regions responsible for memory, perception, and higher-order thought. Now the amounts detected were tiny, far below what would be needed to produce a psychedelic experience through external administration, and the compound's natural function in the brain remains unknown. But here is what makes this finding so provocative. When DMT is given to humans at higher doses in clinical settings, it produces some of the most profound alterations of consciousness ever documented. Subjects consistently report the same things: a sense of leaving the body, encounters with intelligences that do not feel human, access to vast landscapes of information, and a conviction, often unshakable, that what they experienced was more real than ordinary waking life. Your brain makes this compound. We do not know why. Whether or not DMT is the primary mechanism behind mystical experience is still debated, but the fact that your brain produces a compound capable of radically expanding perception, and that the gland responsible for producing it is anatomically descended from a literal third eye, raises questions that are difficult to dismiss. What if expanded perception was once a standard feature of human consciousness? And what if it was dialed down? In the Sumerian texts, the god Enki is repeatedly described as the lord of the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean. But the Abzu is not merely a physical place. It is also, symbolically, the realm of deep knowledge, the hidden waters, the unconscious depths where truth resides. Enki sees what is concealed. He knows what is beneath the surface. His awareness extends beyond the visible world. The ME tablets that he guards contain knowledge that transcends ordinary understanding, not just agricultural techniques or legal codes, but the secrets of perception itself. The ME for divination, the ME for travelling the heavens, the ME for descending to the underworld. These are not skills in the conventional sense, they are modes of awareness, ways of seeing. When the Lulu is created, the text emphasized that this being will not possess the full awareness of the gods. The divine blood gives intelligence, yes, but not sight. Not the kind of sight that the gods possess. The being is given enough consciousness to understand commands, enough awareness to perform tasks, but the deeper perception, the ability to see beyond the veil, is withheld. The Adapa myth makes this even more explicit. Adapa, considered a prototype human or early sage, is brought before the supreme god Anu in heaven. He is offered the bread and water of immortality, which would grant him the full perception and longevity of the gods. But Enki warns Adapa not to consume them. The conventional interpretation is that Enki was protecting Adapa from a trap. But there is another reading, one in which Enki was maintaining the limitation because full divine perception was too dangerous, not for Adapa, but for the gods' control over humanity. A worker that can see beyond the material world is a worker that might begin to ask why it is working at all. In your genome, the genes associated with the pineal gland's more exotic functions, the photoreceptor proteins, the enzymes in the endolamin synthesis pathways, exist, but are largely underexpressed. The machinery for expanded perception is present in your biology. It is simply not running at full capacity. The Sumerians would say it was turned down on purpose. Modern neuroscience would say it evolved that way. Neither explanation has been proven conclusively, but the result, from either perspective, is the same. You carry the hardware for a kind of perception that is not running at full capacity, and the question of why remains genuinely open. Trait 3. The memory. The severance of ancestral recall. Consider for a moment a salmon. Born in a freshwater stream, it migrates thousands of miles to the open ocean, feeds and grows for years, and then, without a map, without being taught, without any external guidance, it returns to the exact stream where it was born to spawn. Not a nearby stream, the same one. It navigates by magnetic fields, by chemical signatures in the water, by an internal compass that has been encoded in its DNA across countless generations. This is genetic memory, information encoded not in the brain but in the genome, a knowledge that is inherited, not learned. Monarch butterflies migrate from Canada to a specific forest in central Mexico, A journey of over 3,000 miles that no individual butterfly has ever made before, because it takes multiple generations to complete. The butterflies that arrive in Mexico have never been there. Their parents have never been there. Their grandparents have never been there. And yet they find it. They find the same trees their great-great-grandparents used. The information is in the DNA. The scientific term is instinct. But instinct is just a word we use when we do not fully understand how information is transmitted across generations without being taught. It is a label for a mystery, not an explanation of one. In recent years, a series of remarkable experiments have begun to illuminate this mystery. In 2013, researchers at Emory University published a landmark study in Nature Neuroscience demonstrating that mice who were trained to fear a specific odour, cherry blossom, technically acetophenon, produced offspring that also feared that odour, even though the offspring had never been exposed to it and had no contact with their parents. The fear response was transmitted not through learning, not through social behaviour, but through epigenetic marks on the DNA, specifically through changes in the methylation patterns of the olfactory receptor gene OLFR151, which is responsible for detecting that particular scent. The offspring's brains even showed structural differences. They had more neurons dedicated to detecting that specific odour, as if their nervous systems had been pre-configured by an experience they never had. This is transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, and it suggests that your DNA is not merely a blueprint for building a body. It is an archive, a library of experiences accumulated over countless generations. The implications extend far beyond mice and odours. Studies on Holocaust survivors have found that their descendants carry distinct epigenetic signatures, altered methylation patterns on genes associated with stress response, that correlate with their parents' and grandparents' trauma. Similar findings have emerged from studies on famine survivors, refugees, and populations exposed to extreme adversity. The body records its experiences in the genome, and the genome transmits them forward. Now consider what happens when you multiply this principle across not dozens but thousands of generations, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. What kind of ancestral library might be embedded in the non-coding regions of your genome? What memories, what knowledge, what experiences might be recorded there? Inaccessible, not because they have been erased, but because the reading mechanism has been switched off. The Sumerian texts describe the ME, usually translated as divine decrees or divine powers, as the fundamental knowledge systems of civilization. The ME covered everything from kingship to truth, to the art of the scribe, to the descent into the underworld. They were not merely laws or skills, they were patterns of knowledge embedded in transferable structures. Inanna steals them from Enki by getting him drunk, loads them onto a boat, and carries them to her city of Uruk. The ME are physical, or at least semi-physical, embodiments of encoded knowledge. When Enki fashions the Lulu, the text makes clear that the new being will not have access to the full ME. Certain knowledge systems are reserved for the gods alone. The human receives enough intelligence to function, to follow commands, to learn tasks through instruction, to maintain the temples and the fields. But the deeper knowledge, the ancestral archive of the divine, is placed beyond reach. In one of the most haunting passages of the Atrahasis narrative, after the creation is complete, the mother goddess Nintu weeps. The exact reason for her grief is lost in damaged lines of the tablet, but the context suggests she is mourning what was taken away, the potential that the new creature will never know it possesses. You carry, right now in the 98% of your genome that does not code for proteins, an immense archive of regulatory information, repetitive sequences, transposable elements, and structures that have been accumulating for hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Researchers at MIT have shown that satellite DNA, repetitive sequences that make up over 10% of the genome, plays a critical role in species identity and cellular organization. And these satellite DNA sequences are among the most rapidly evolving elements in the genome, meaning they are anything but static. They are dynamic, active, changing. What else is in there? What else is recorded in those vast stretches of silent code? We do not know, because most of it has never been read. Not because the information is gone, but because the reading mechanism is off. Trait 4, the healing, the suppression of regenerative capacity. If you cut the leg off a salamander, it will grow back, not a scar, not a stump, a fully formed, fully functional new leg, bones, muscles, nerves, blood vessels, skin, even the pattern of colouring. Complete regeneration in a matter of weeks. The axolotl, a related species, can regenerate not just limbs, but portions of its heart, its spinal cord, and even parts of its brain. If you cut the leg off a human, it does not grow back. We heal wounds, yes. We repair broken bones, slowly, imperfectly. We can regenerate liver tissue to a limited degree, but we do not regenerate lost organs or limbs. The question that has haunted regenerative biology for decades is, why not? Because the genes for regeneration are in your DNA. This is not speculation. The genetic toolkit required for limb regeneration, the signaling pathways, the growth factors, the transcription factors that orchestrate the formation of a new limb, is present in the human genome. We share these genes with salamanders. We share many of them with zebrafish, which can regenerate their hearts after significant damage. We share them with planarian flatworms, which can regenerate their entire body, including the brain, from a fragment as small as 1/279th of the original organism. The difference is not in the genes, it is in how those genes are regulated. In salamanders, something extraordinary happens after an injury. The cells near the wound do not simply patch the damage, they reverse. Muscle cells, nerve cells, skin cells, they shed their specializations and revert to something like stem cells. They form a structure called a blastema, a knot of raw potential at the wound site, and from that knot a new limb grows, not a scar, not a rough approximation, a perfect copy. Bones, nerves, blood vessels, skin, all of it, regrown from scratch, following the same blueprint that built the original. In humans, the opposite happens. Injury triggers a scarring response. Your cells lay down collagen and seal the wound with fibrous tissue. It is fast. It is effective at stopping blood loss, but it is a dead end. Scar tissue cannot become anything else. It cannot grow into a new limb or a new organ. It is a wall where a door used to be. The regenerative program exists in your genome. It is overridden by the scarring program. The question is why? Researchers have begun to explore this. By manipulating specific signaling pathways, it is possible to nudge the wound response away from scarring and toward regeneration. In 2013, researchers at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School demonstrated that reactivating a single gene, Lin28A, could enhance tissue repair in mice, partially restoring a regenerative capacity that is normally lost shortly after birth. Newborn mice can regrow heart tissue and even the tips of their digits. But within days of birth, epigenetic changes silence the responsible genes. The window closes. The program shuts down. The pattern is consistent. The capacity for regeneration is present in the genome, but has been epigenetically suppressed in adult humans. The programs are there. They ran during early development, and then they were switched off. The Sumerian texts describe the gods as possessing extraordinary physical resilience. The Anunnaki do not age as humans do. They are not invulnerable, but they recover from injuries in ways that mortals cannot. In the myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld, the goddess is killed and hung on a hook, and is later resurrected by two beings sent by Enki, who sprinkle her with the water of life and the food of life. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero searches for a plant at the bottom of the sea that will restore youth, a plant that exists but is beyond ordinary human reach. When the Lulu was created, it was given enough physical robustness to perform labour, enough healing to recover from the daily injuries of canal digging and field work, but not the full regenerative power of its divine template. A worker that can regrow a lost limb is a worker that is much harder to control through physical consequences. A worker that scars but does not regenerate is a worker that remembers pain, that fears injury, that obeys because the body teaches it to. The limitation was not accidental, it was functional, and the genes that could reverse it are still inside you, waiting. Trait 5. The voice. The silencing of direct biological communication. Every cell in your body communicates. This is not a metaphor. Right now, as you listen to this, billions of cells are sending and receiving chemical signals, neurotransmitters, hormones, cytokines, electrical impulses travelling at up to 270 miles per hour along myelinated nerve fibres, and molecular messages carried by exosomes and microvesicles through the bloodstream. It is the most complex communication network in the known universe, and you are completely unaware of most of it. But there is a form of biological communication that operates outside the conventional channels, and it has proven remarkably difficult for science to explain. In 1997, researchers at the University of Freiburg published a study reporting that human neural cells growing in separate shielded dishes appeared to exhibit correlated electrical activity, even when separated by distances that ruled out any known chemical or electromagnetic connection. The study was met with intense skepticism, and subsequent attempts to replicate it have produced mixed results at best. Most neuroscientists remain unconvinced, but the question it raised, whether biological communication might operate through channels we have not yet identified, has continued to surface in different forms. In humans, the study of mirror neurons, neurons that fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing it, has revealed a biological basis for empathy that operates below the level of conscious thought. Discovered in the 1990s by Giacomo Rizzolatti and his team at the University of Parma, mirror neurons provide a mechanism by which one brain can simulate the internal state of another. You do not decide to feel what another person feels. Your nervous system does it automatically through a mechanism that creates an internal copy of the observed experience. And then there are the stranger findings, the ones that sit at the edge of what mainstream science is willing to discuss. At Princeton University, the Peer Laboratory spent nearly 3 decades running millions of trials that seemed to suggest human intention could nudge random physical systems in a measurable direction. The effects were tiny. The methodology was fiercely debated. Many scientists remain unconvinced, but the data was consistent, across operators, across machines, across decades. Whatever was happening, it did not go away when you looked more closely at it. A parallel project, the Global Consciousness Project, has monitored a network of random number generators around the world since 1998 and has reported deviations from expected randomness during major global events, though these claims too remain contested. We are not in the territory of established science here. We are at its frontier, and frontiers, by definition, are where the map has not yet been drawn. The Sumerian concept of the Nam Shub, the incantation of power, describes a form of communication that operates through intention and vibrational frequency rather than spoken language. In the myth of Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata, the text describes a time when all of humanity spoke a single language, not in the sense of a common vocabulary, but in the sense of a shared mode of direct understanding. The text reads, in part, "In those days there was no snake, there was no scorpion, there was no hyena. The whole universe, the people in unison spoke to Enlil in one tongue." Enki is then credited, in one widely cited translation, with confusing human speech, fragmenting the unified mode of communication into separate limited languages. It should be noted that scholars debate the meaning of this passage, and some translations render it differently, as Enki bringing linguistic unity rather than confusion. But the version that describes fragmentation is strikingly similar to the Tower of Babel narrative in Genesis. But in the Sumerian version, the emphasis is not on vocabulary. It is on the mode of communication itself. The original capacity was direct, mind to mind, intention to intention. The fragmented version, spoken language, is indirect, imprecise, and easily misunderstood. Your nervous system contains approximately 86 billion neurons, each capable of forming up to 10,000 synaptic connections. The total number of possible neural configurations in a single human brain exceeds the number of atoms in the observable universe. This is a communication system of almost incomprehensible complexity and bandwidth. And yet, we use it primarily to process spoken and written language, a serial, linear, highly lossy form of information transfer. We convert vast, multidimensional internal experiences into one-dimensional strings of words, transmit them through the air as pressure waves, and hope that the receiver can reconstruct something resembling the original meaning. This is the communication mode that the tablets describe as a deliberate downgrade from something more powerful. The hardware is extraordinary. The software running on it is comparatively primitive, as though the system were designed for something far more capable than what we currently use it for. Trait 6. The connection. The severing of cosmic awareness. You're not separate from the cosmos. Your biology is woven into it. This is not poetry. It is established science. Your cells contain cryptochrome proteins, the same proteins that birds use to sense the Earth's magnetic field for navigation. In fruit flies, cryptochromes have been shown to enable a form of quantum-level magnetic sensing. Whether human cryptochromes serve a similar function is still being investigated, but the proteins are there, in your cells, expressed and active. Your circadian rhythm, the internal clock that governs sleep, hormone production, body temperature and cellular repair, is synchronized not just to the 24-hour cycle of day and night, but to deeper cycles as well. Research has demonstrated that human biology responds to lunar cycles. A study published in Science Advances in 2021 found that human sleep patterns oscillate with the 29-day lunar cycle, with people sleeping less and going to bed later in the days leading up to a full moon. This effect was observed even in populations without electricity, suggesting it is not driven by moonlight alone but by an internal biological sensitivity to the lunar gravitational or electromagnetic cycle. Your body responds to solar activity as well. Studies have correlated geomagnetic storms, disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field caused by solar flares, with increases in hospital admissions for cardiovascular events, changes in melatonin production, and alterations in blood pressure. The mechanism is still being investigated, but the correlation is statistically robust across multiple studies spanning decades. Indigenous cultures around the world have preserved this understanding in their traditions. Australian Aboriginal peoples describe the dream time, a dimension of consciousness where the individual connects with the cosmic order, with the land, with the patterns of stars and seasons. Andean traditions speak of Pachamama, the living earth, and the reciprocal relationship between human consciousness and the natural world. Hindu cosmology describes the Akashic field, a universal repository of information accessible to every consciousness. The Sumerians described the Anunnaki as beings who understood the movements of the stars with extraordinary precision. The Malapin tablets, among the oldest astronomical records in existence, catalogue star positions, planetary cycles, and celestial events with a level of accuracy that has astonished modern astronomers. But the texts do not describe this knowledge as calculated from observation alone. They describe it as perceived, as a form of direct knowing that extended beyond the boundaries of the body into the cosmic field itself. When the Lulu was created, this connection was diminished. Not severed entirely, humans retained a dim awareness of cosmic rhythms, enough to plant crops by the seasons, enough to feel the pull of the tides, enough to know that something shifts inside us when the moon is full. But the direct conscious experience of cosmic unity was withheld. Humans could see the stars, but they could not feel them the way the gods did. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes the cosmos as a living body. Marduk fashions the heavens from the body of Tiamat, the primordial goddess. The stars are not distant objects, they are organs within a living system, and the gods interact with this system consciously, the way you interact with your own body. The biological infrastructure for cosmic awareness is already inside you. Cryptochrome proteins sensitive to magnetic fields, circadian genes responsive to astronomical cycles, a nervous system that demonstrably reacts to solar and lunar influences. The receptors are there, the sensitivity exists, but the signal processing has been turned down to a whisper. Trait 7. The sovereignty, the suppression of autonomous spiritual evolution. This is the deepest one, the one that underlies all the others. It is not about a specific gene or a specific biological system. It is about the totality of who you are and the capacity to determine independently what you become. In evolutionary biology, there is a concept sometimes called self-directed evolution or conscious evolution. The idea is that sufficiently complex organisms might, under certain conditions, be able to influence their own evolutionary trajectory, not through random mutation and natural selection alone, but through intentional modification of the conditions that shape gene expression. This sounds radical, but the mechanisms for it already exist. Epigenetic changes, the chemical modifications that silence or activate genes, can be influenced by behavior, by environment, by thought patterns, and by emotional state. Meditation has been shown to alter gene expression in measurable ways. In one study at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a single day of intensive mindfulness practice, just one day, produced detectable changes in the expression of genes related to inflammation and stress. The meditators' bodies were literally rewriting their own code in real time. Another study found that long-term meditators showed increased activity of telomerase, the very enzyme we discussed earlier, the one that rebuilds the caps on your chromosomes. Their cells were aging more slowly, not because of a drug, because of how they chose to use their attention. Exercise does it too. A single workout alters the methylation patterns of hundreds of genes. So does diet. Specific compounds in broccoli, in grapes, in turmeric have been shown to directly modify the chemical tags that determine which genes are active and which are silent, and trauma does it. The children of famine survivors carry different methylation patterns than their peers. The grandchildren of Holocaust survivors show altered stress response genes. The body records what happens to it and transmits the record forward. But healing changes the record too. Psychotherapy has been shown to rewrite the epigenetic signature of traumatic experience. The idea that consciousness and intention can influence biology is not mysticism, it is epigenetics. Now extend this principle to its logical conclusion. If a sufficiently aware being understood its own genome, if it could consciously direct the epigenetic machinery that controls gene expression, it could, in theory, modify itself, activate dormant genes, silence harmful ones, direct its own evolution not over millions of years, but within a single lifetime, and pass those changes to the next generation. This is what the Sumerians describe as the power of the gods, not magic, not supernatural ability, but conscious control over biological processes, the ability to heal at will, to live for millennia, to perceive across vast distances, to communicate directly, to evolve deliberately, and this is what was denied to the Lulu. The seventh and most fundamental removal was not a specific trait, it was the meta-capability, the capacity for autonomous spiritual evolution, the ability of the created being to take control of its own development, and eventually to become equal to its creators. The Atrahasis epic is, at its core, a story about control. The gods create humanity to serve them. When humanity grows too numerous, the gods try to destroy them. When that fails, they impose limitations, shorter lifespans, mortality, suffering. Every measure is designed to keep the created being in its designated role. But here is the part of the story that most people miss. The limitations do not work. Humanity survives the flood. Humanity rebuilds. Humanity develops agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine, philosophy, physics, genetics. Every tool that was supposed to be reserved for the gods, every ME, is gradually rediscovered, reinvented, or reclaimed. The Epic of Inanna describes the goddess literally stealing the ME from Enki and bringing them to her city of Uruk. This is not just a divine squabble, it is a metaphor for the unstoppable drive of human consciousness to reclaim what was taken. And that drive, according to the tablets, is the one thing the gods could never fully remove, because it comes from the divine blood itself, the essence of the slain god Geshtui, whose intelligence and consciousness were mixed into the clay, the divine spark, the irreducible seed of potential. The seed of full consciousness is still there, buried deep, silenced but not destroyed, dormant but not dead. And this is perhaps the most extraordinary claim in the entire Sumerian corpus, that the limitation was always incomplete, that the human being was designed with a flaw the gods did not anticipate, or that Enki embedded deliberately, the capacity to wake up. Let's step back and look at what we have laid out tonight. 7 areas of inquiry, 7 places where the oldest texts on Earth describe a reduction in human capability, and where modern biology has independently discovered systems that are present in the genome but suppressed, underexpressed, or epigenetically silenced. We do not need to list them again. You have walked through each one. You have felt the shape of the argument. What matters now is not the individual threads, but the fabric they form when woven together. And that fabric gained new threads in 2022, when the Telomere to Telomere Consortium published what the original Human Genome Project had not been able to deliver: a truly complete, gapless sequence of the human genome. The 2003 project, for all its accomplishment, had left roughly 8% of the genome unfinished, the most repetitive, most structurally complex regions, clustered around the centromeres and telomeres of every chromosome, the portions that hold the chromosomes together, the portions that mark the beginning and end of every strand. For 2 decades, these regions were essentially invisible. The T2T project, published in Science in April 2022, added nearly 200 million base pairs of previously unknown sequence. Within that newly charted territory, researchers identified 99 genes predicted to code for proteins and nearly 2,000 additional candidate genes requiring further study. Most of this new sequence consisted of centromeric satellite DNA and segmental duplications, the very categories of repetitive DNA that earlier researchers had most confidently dismissed as non-functional. In other words, the last 8% of the genome to be read was precisely the territory that had been assumed to be the least interesting. And it turned out to contain thousands of previously invisible genetic elements. We are still in the early chapters of understanding what is in our own code, and there is another dimension to the non-coding genome that deepens the mystery further, and it is one of the strangest things modern biology has discovered about what you are made of. Approximately 8% of your DNA is not human. It is viral. Let that land for a moment. 8%, more than 4 times the amount that codes for your proteins, your eye colour, your height, your predisposition to disease. These are human endogenous retroviruses, HERVs, the remnants of ancient infections that occurred not in your lifetime but tens of millions of years ago. Viruses that infected the reproductive cells of our distant ancestors and, instead of being cleared, were absorbed, woven into the genome, passed down through every generation since, like a scar that became a birthmark that became a feature. For decades, HERVs were considered the ultimate example of junk, parasitic debris, viral fossils, dead code from battles fought before mammals existed, and most of them are indeed broken, mutated beyond function, silent passengers, but not all of them. A gene called syncytin-1, derived from an ancient retrovirus, turns out to be essential for human pregnancy. Without it, the placenta cannot form, the very organ that connects a mother to her child. The boundary that makes mammalian life possible is built using machinery borrowed from a virus that infected our ancestors millions of years ago. And in 2024, a study published in Nature Communications found something even more unsettling. Common genetic variants linked to psychiatric disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression, influence the regulation of specific HERVs in the brain. Ancient viral code integrated into our genome before our species existed appears to be shaping the architecture of modern human consciousness. What does this mean? It means your genome is not a single document written by one hand. It is a palimpsest, a manuscript overwritten again and again in different inks across geological time. Some of those layers are human, some are viral, some are regulatory, some are unknown, and the oldest layers, the ones buried deepest, are only now becoming legible. The Sumerian tablets do not describe these details, of course. They do not speak of retroviruses or centromeric satellites, but they do describe a genome, a divine blueprint that was deliberately modified, layers added, capabilities removed, functions silenced. The vocabulary is different, the observation rhymes. There is a poignant tension at the heart of Enki's role in the creation narrative. He is both the architect of humanity's limitation and the one who consistently works to undo it. He designs the Lulu with reduced capacities because the Council of Gods demands it. But then he teaches humanity the arts of civilization. He gives us writing. He gives us medicine. He gives us the knowledge of the stars. He sends the 7 sages, the Apkallu, to instruct humanity in the foundational technologies of culture. Every gift is a small act of restoration, a piece of the original template returned. The Apkallu deserve particular attention here. These 7 sages, half human, half fish, beings in some depictions, fully human in others, were said to have emerged from the Abzu, Enki's domain, in the earliest days of human civilization. They appeared in the first cities, Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak, and taught humanity the essential arts: writing, building, agriculture, astronomy, divination, medicine, and the rituals of the temple. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BCE, described the first of these sages, Oan, as a being who emerged from the Persian Gulf each day to teach the people, and who returned to the waters each night. Berossus wrote that before Oan's, the people of Mesopotamia lived without order, like beasts. After his teachings, nothing further was invented. Everything that followed was a refinement of what the sage had given. The 7 sages were, in essence, Enki's field agents, his emissaries. the delivery mechanism for the knowledge that the Council of Gods had tried to withhold. Each sage represented one domain of civilization, one piece of the original template being quietly returned to the limited creature, and the Sumerians revered them above almost all other figures. The Apkallu appear in protective amulets, in temple carvings, in ritual texts spanning 2,000 years. They were considered the foundation of everything that made human civilization possible. Without them there would be no writing, no cities, no medicine, no knowledge of the stars. In some readings of the texts, Enki's entire project is one of gradual rehabilitation. He could not give humanity everything at once. Enlil would have destroyed us entirely, but he could give it to us piece by piece, generation by generation, allowing us to grow into our own potential at a pace that would not trigger the wrath of the heavens. There is a strange beauty to this idea. A god who creates something limited, because he must, and then spends the rest of eternity trying to undo his own work. A creator who becomes a liberator, an engineer who becomes a teacher. The one who built the cage also hid the key inside it. And if Enki's project is ongoing, if the restoration of human capability is a process that has been unfolding across millennia, then where are we now? Consider the trajectory. 10,000 years ago, humans were hunter-gatherers with no written language and no permanent settlements. 5,000 years ago, we had cities, mathematics, astronomy, and codified law. 2,000 years ago, we had philosophy, engineering, and early medicine. 500 years ago, the scientific revolution began. 150 years ago, we discovered genetics. 70 years ago, we decoded the structure of DNA. 20 years ago, we mapped the human genome. 10 years ago, we began editing it with CRISPR. The acceleration is not linear. It is exponential. Each breakthrough compresses the time to the next breakthrough. Each restored capability enables the discovery of the next. The curve is steepening. The approach is quickening. And it is moving, with extraordinary precision, toward exactly the kind of knowledge that the Sumerian tablets describe as having been withheld. The knowledge of the code itself. The knowledge that the gods used to create and limit us. The knowledge that, once in our hands, makes the limitation reversible. If this is Enki's project, we are in its final chapters. Everything we know about the Sumerian creation accounts owes its survival to a single act of obsessive royal ambition that took place in the 7th century BCE. Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Assyrian Empire, was unlike his predecessors. While other kings measured their legacy in conquered cities and slain enemies, Ashurbanipal measured his in tablets. He was, by all accounts, the first true bibliophile of recorded history. A warrior king who could also read and write in both Akkadian and Sumerian, a rare accomplishment even among the educated elite of his time. He dispatched scribes across the entire known world with a singular mission: collect every written text in existence and bring it to Nineveh. The library he assembled was staggering. Over 30,000 clay tablets and fragments stacked in rooms beneath the palace floors, organized by subject: astronomy, medicine, law, divination, mathematics, mythology, ritual, and the creation epics that form the backbone of tonight's exploration. If you had walked into that library in the 7th century BCE, you would have seen shelves of clay reaching to the ceiling, each tablet tagged with a colophon identifying its contents. The smell of dry clay and bitumen, the weight of a civilization's memory concentrated in one place. When the British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard excavated Nineveh in 1849, and his assistant Hormuzd Rassam continued the work, they uncovered this library buried beneath centuries of sand and rubble, and among the tablets was the most complete surviving copy of the Atrahasis epic, the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh, the texts that describe in detail the creation and limitation of humanity. In 1872, a self-taught Assyriologist named George Smith was translating fragments from Nineveh at the British Museum when he realized he was reading a flood narrative that predated the biblical account by at least 1,000 years. The discovery caused a public sensation. Smith reportedly became so excited that he began undressing in the workroom. The story was that significant. The parallels were that undeniable. The fact that these texts survived at all is remarkable. The fact that they were deliberately collected and preserved by a king who understood their significance suggests that, even in antiquity, there were those who recognized these were not merely stories. They were records, archives of something that had happened, something that needed to be remembered. The myth of Adapa is one of the most enigmatic texts in the Mesopotamian corpus. Adapa is described as a sage, one of the first fully realized humans, a priest of Enki's temple in Eridu, and a being of extraordinary wisdom and ability. He understands the workings of the cosmos. He can perform rituals that influence the natural world. He is, in many ways, the closest thing the Sumerian tradition has to a fully functional human, a being who approaches the original divine template. But Adapa is mortal. He has great wisdom but not eternal life. He comes tantalizingly close to the full divine condition and falls just short. The pivotal moment comes when Adapa breaks the wing of the south wind, an act of extraordinary power that attracts the attention of Anu. The supreme god summons Adapa to heaven, and there, in the celestial court, he is offered the bread of life and the water of life, the substances that would grant immortality, and by implication, the full suite of divine capabilities. But Enki has warned Adapa not to eat or drink anything offered by the gods, telling him that what Anu offers is the bread of death and the water of death. Adapa obeys, he refuses, and the opportunity is lost. Anu is astonished, and perhaps disappointed. He asks why Adapa will not eat. And when Adapa explains Enki's warning, Anu realizes what Enki has done. The food was genuine. The immortality was real. Enki deceived his own creation. Or did he? Scholars have debated this passage for over a century. Was Enki deceiving Adapa? Was he protecting him from a divine trap? Was Anu genuinely offering a gift or testing whether humanity could be trusted with full power? But there is another way to read this myth. What if Enki was not lying but managing a transition? What if giving a human the full divine capability all at once, without preparation, without the consciousness to handle it, would have been catastrophic? What if the bread and water of life were real, but Adapa was not yet ready to metabolize what they offered? This reading casts Enki not as a deceiver but as a teacher who understands that knowledge must be acquired gradually, that the 7 removed traits cannot simply be switched back on all at once, that the restoration must follow a sequence, a process of growth, awakening and preparation that would take not years but millennia. The creation experiments, a process that reads like genetic engineering. We briefly mentioned the creation attempts earlier, but this detail deserves much deeper attention because it is one of the most scientifically suggestive elements in the entire Mesopotamian corpus. The creation accounts emerge from 2 distinct but thematically related texts. In the Atrahasis, the creation of humanity proceeds through a specific recipe: divine blood mixed with clay, shaped into 14 forms, 7 male, 7 female, placed in the womb of the mother goddess. This is presented as the successful procedure, but the separate text known as Enki and Ninmah describes what appears to be an earlier or parallel stage of experimentation. In this account, Enki and the mother goddess, after a celebration involving beer, engage in a creation contest, each trying to fashion beings and assign them roles. The beings that Ninmah creates have striking functional deficits. One cannot close its hands, another cannot hold urine, one cannot eat bread, another cannot stand upright. Each is described with a specific biological limitation, not a metaphysical error, not spiritual failing, but a concrete malfunction. Whether these 2 texts describe sequential stages of a single process or independent mythological episodes is debated by scholars. But taken together, they paint an image that is unusual in world mythology. Creation as an iterative, imperfect process involving trial, error, and gradual refinement. This is remarkable. Mythological creation accounts typically do not include failure. In most traditions, the creator deity speaks, and the creation appears, fully formed, fully functional. The Genesis account describes God creating man from dust and breathing life into him in a single, seamless act. There is no trial and error, no prototypes, no defective models that had to be discarded. But the Sumerian account reads differently. It reads like a research log, like the notes of an experimenter who's working through a difficult technical problem, trying different configurations, observing the results, adjusting the parameters, and trying again. If you were to describe the process of genetic engineering to someone who had never heard the term, if you had to explain gene editing using only the vocabulary and conceptual framework available in 2000 BCE, what would it sound like? It might sound exactly like this. A divine substance, call it blood, call it essence, is mixed with earthly material. The mixture is shaped into a form, the form is activated, and the result is evaluated for functionality. When the result is deficient, the process is repeated with modifications until a viable product is achieved. Modern gene editing experiments follow precisely this pattern. CRISPR-modified embryos are evaluated for off-target effects. Genetic modifications sometimes produce organisms with unexpected deficits, behavioral abnormalities, metabolic dysfunction, structural deformities. The process of getting from concept to functional organism is iterative. It involves failure, multiple attempts, gradual refinement. The Sumerian texts describe this iterative process 4,000 years before the word gene was ever spoken. The question is not whether the ancient scribes understood genetics in the modern sense. They almost certainly did not. The question is whether they were describing, in the language available to them, a process that they witnessed or inherited knowledge of, a process that, in its structure and its challenges, mirrors what we now know to be true about the difficulty of engineering a living organism. The Sumerian account is the oldest, but it is far from the only one. Across the ancient world, civilization after civilization recorded variations of the same fundamental narrative. Human beings were created by non-human intelligences, and the creation involved deliberate limitation. In ancient Egypt, the god Khnum is depicted at a potter's wheel, fashioning human beings from clay on the banks of the Nile. The imagery is nearly identical to the Sumerian account, a divine craftsman shaping humans from earthen material. But the Egyptian tradition adds a detail that the Sumerian texts leave implicit. Khnum places a ka, a vital life force, into the clay, but the ka he gives to humans is a lesser version of the one the gods possess. The full divine ka is reserved for the gods and the pharaohs, who claim partial divine descent. In the Vedic traditions of ancient India, the Rig Veda describes the sacrifice of Purusha, the cosmic being, from whose dismembered body the universe and all creatures are formed. But the text specifies a hierarchy of creation. The mouth of Purusha becomes the priestly class, the arms become the warriors, the thighs become the merchants, and the feet become the servants. Different portions of the divine body yield different levels of capability. Not all creations are equal. Not all receive the same endowment. The Popol Vuh of the Maya describes a creation process that is even more explicitly iterative than the Sumerian account. The gods attempt to create humans multiple times. The first humans, made of mud, dissolve in water. The second, made of wood, can move and speak but have no minds. They cannot remember their creators or worship them. These wooden people are destroyed in a flood. Only the third attempt, in which humans are made from maize, produces beings with full awareness and capability, and even these are then deliberately limited because the gods fear that they see too much and know too much. The Popol Vuh describes how the vision of these first perfect humans was deliberately clouded. One well-known translation renders the passage as their sight being dimmed, as when one breathes on the face of a mirror. Their eyes were obscured so they could only see what was near. This is an astonishingly specific description of the removal of expanded perception, the same trait we discussed as the second removal from the Sumerian tablets. The language is different, the culture is different, the continent is different. But the narrative structure is identical. Humans were once able to see clearly, and that clarity was taken from them. In Greek mythology, Prometheus creates humanity from clay, again the earthen material, and gives them fire, the symbol of divine knowledge. Zeus punishes Prometheus by chaining him to a rock where an eagle eats his liver daily, a liver that regenerates each night, only to be consumed again. The symbolism is layered. The creator who gives too much to humanity is punished by the ruling god. The organ that regenerates, the liver, is the one that is perpetually destroyed. Regeneration and its suppression, and it's encoded in myth. In Norse mythology, the first humans, Ask and Embla, are created from tree trunks by three gods. Odin gives them breath and life. Vili gives them consciousness and movement. Ve gives them form, speech, hearing, and sight. But the gifts are distributed selectively. Odin keeps the deeper powers, the runes, the ability to traverse the 9 worlds, the power to speak with the dead, for himself and those he chooses to initiate. The pattern is consistent across cultures that had no confirmed contact with one another. Creation from earthen material, a divine essence added to animate the form, multiple attempts or a hierarchy of creation, specific capabilities withheld or removed, and a ruling deity or council of gods that maintains control by keeping the full spectrum of divine power out of human reach. Scholars have offered several explanations for this convergence. Some argue these motifs reflect universal features of human psychology, a shared cognitive architecture that naturally generates similar stories about origins and limitation. Others suggest diffusion through ancient trade routes and migrations we have not yet fully mapped. And there is a third possibility, one that mainstream scholarship does not entertain, but that the patterns themselves make difficult to ignore entirely, that these civilizations were all remembering, in their own languages and through their own cultural lenses, something rooted in a shared ancestral experience. We cannot say with certainty which explanation is correct, but the convergence itself is remarkable. There is one more detail about the Sumerian tradition that deserves attention before we move to the modern implications, and it concerns the language itself. The Sumerian language is a linguistic isolate. It belongs to no known language family. It has no confirmed relatives anywhere on Earth. Its grammar, agglutinative, with clearly defined prefixes and suffixes that modify meaning in systematic ways, is structurally unlike any of the Semitic languages that surrounded it, or the Indo-European languages that later spread across the region. Linguists have searched for connections for over a century. Proposals have been made linking Sumerian to languages as far-flung as Hungarian, Turkish, Tamil, Japanese, and even Tibetan. None of these proposals has gained mainstream acceptance. Sumerian stands alone. The Sumerians themselves offered an explanation for this. They said their language was given to them by the gods. In the myth of Enki and the world order, the god Enki assigns languages to different regions, including the Sumerian language to the people of Sumer. Language in this framework is not something that evolves organically. It is bestowed, designed, implemented, and indeed, when you examine the structure of Sumerian, it has qualities that some linguists have noted as distinctive for an ancient language. Its agglutinative grammar builds complex meanings by stacking morphemes in relatively predictable ways. Its vocabulary is built on a foundation of monosyllabic roots that combine to form complex meanings. That said, Sumerian also has its share of irregularities, ambiguities, and unresolved puzzles, like any natural language. Scholars continue to debate fundamental aspects of its phonology and grammar to this day. But the Sumerians' own account of their language's origin remains striking. They did not describe it as something that evolved organically. They described it as something given, designed, bestowed by the gods. Whether this reflects literal history or cultural pride is, like so much else in this story, a matter of interpretation. In 2012, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier published a paper that would change biology forever. They had discovered a way to use a bacterial immune system called CRISPR-Cas9 as a precision tool for editing DNA. For the first time in history, humanity had the ability to cut, delete, insert, and modify specific sequences in the genome with extraordinary accuracy and relative ease. The implications were immediate and profound. Genetic diseases could potentially be cured at the source, not managed with drugs but rewritten in the code itself. Agricultural crops could be redesigned for resilience, and most controversially, the human genome could be intentionally modified before birth. In November 2018, a Chinese researcher named He Jiankui announced that he had used CRISPR to edit the genomes of 2 human embryos, twin girls, modifying a gene called CCR5 to make them resistant to HIV infection. The announcement sent shockwaves through the scientific community, not because the technology failed, because it worked. Humanity had crossed a threshold that had been discussed in theoretical terms for decades. We had edited a living human genome. We had done what only the gods were supposed to do. Think about that in the context of everything we have discussed tonight. For thousands of years, the creation text described a species that was engineered, limited, stripped of its full potential by beings who possessed the knowledge to manipulate life at the genetic level. And now, in the 21st century, the engineered species has reinvented the engineer's tools. The question that looms over all of it is what we do next. Do we use these tools to further limit, to control, to engineer compliance as the tablets suggest was done to us? Or do we use them to restore, to reactivate, to reclaim? But CRISPR is only one dimension of this story. The other, perhaps more important dimension, is what we explored earlier, epigenetics, because while CRISPR allows external modification of the genome, epigenetics reveals that your own consciousness, behavior, and choices are already modifying your gene expression every single day. We covered the mechanisms in detail. What matters here is the implication. The ancient traditions, yoga, meditation, breathwork, fasting, vision questing, prolonged prayer, can now be understood through a biological lens. These are not merely spiritual practices. They are epigenetic protocols, methods for altering gene expression through controlled changes in physiology, neurochemistry, and attentional focus. When a meditator sits in stillness for an hour and emerges with measurably reduced inflammation, lower cortisol, and altered expression of genes associated with cellular aging, that is not placebo. That is biology. That's a human being using consciousness to modify their own genome in real time. And if the 7 themes we have traced are indeed pointing toward epigenetically suppressed systems, silenced by methylation patterns and histone modifications rather than deleted from the genome entirely, then the path to reactivation does not necessarily require a laboratory. It may begin with awareness, with intention, with the deliberate cultivation of states of consciousness that have been practiced, preserved, and transmitted by wisdom traditions for thousands of years. This is the most radical implication of everything we have discussed tonight. Not that an extraterrestrial civilization once limited humanity, but that the limitation may have been designed to be temporary, and that the key to understanding it has been inside you all along, encoded in the very code that defines you. If these patterns have been present for thousands of years, why would anyone notice them now? What is different about this moment in human history? The answer may lie in a convergence of factors that have never before existed simultaneously. For most of human history, the Sumerian tablets were buried under the sands of Mesopotamia, inaccessible to anyone. The cuneiform script was undecipherable until the 19th century. The texts were scattered across museums on 3 continents, often catalogued incorrectly or sitting unread in basement storage. It's only in the last few decades that comprehensive translations have become widely available, and only in the last few years that digital archives have allowed anyone with an internet connection to read the same scholarship that was once reserved for a handful of specialists in a handful of universities. Meanwhile, the scientific framework to interpret what those texts might be describing has materialized almost entirely within the past generation. We are living in the first era of humans who have both the ancient texts and the molecular vocabulary to read them side by side. And perhaps most significantly, there is a growing recognition that the reductionist model of biology, the idea that understanding the parts gives you understanding of the whole, is incomplete. Systems biology, network science, and complexity theory are revealing that the genome is not a simple instruction manual. It is a dynamic, self-referential, context-sensitive information system that responds to its environment in ways that linear models cannot predict. The 3-dimensional folding of chromatin, the interplay between non-coding RNA and histone modification, the influence of electromagnetic fields on gene expression, these are not footnotes, they are the main text. And we are only beginning to learn to read it. Whether or not that reading will confirm what the tablets describe remains to be seen, but the fact that the reading is now possible, that we have both the question and the tools to pursue it, is itself extraordinary. There is a reason this conversation does not happen in mainstream academic settings, and it is worth acknowledging openly, in the academic world. Suggesting that ancient myths might describe literal events, particularly events involving non-human intelligence and genetic engineering, is a career-ending proposition. The framework within which ancient texts are studied in universities is firmly literary and anthropological. Myths are treated as reflections of the psychological and social concerns of the cultures that produced them. They are analysed for their symbolic meaning, their narrative structure, their political function. They are never, under any circumstances, treated as potential records of actual events involving advanced technology. This taboo serves a purpose. It protects the rigour of the disciplines. It prevents a flood of unfounded speculation from contaminating evidence-based scholarship. These are legitimate concerns, but the taboo also creates a blind spot. When a distinguished Assyriologist translates a Sumerian text that describes the creation of a human-animal hybrid, using divine blood and earthly clay, a process involving multiple experimental failures before a viable result is achieved, The scholar is professionally obligated to interpret that text as a metaphor, even if every detail of the text reads more naturally as a technical description than as a symbol. Even if the same scholar would immediately recognize the described process as genetic engineering if it appeared in a modern context. The result is that the most straightforward reading of the Sumerian texts, the reading that takes them at face value, has been largely ceded to popular culture, where it is often handled without the rigor it deserves. Serious scholars who might bring analytical discipline to this reading choose not to, because the professional consequences are too severe. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural feature of how academic knowledge is organized. But it does mean that one of the most important questions a human being can ask, were we engineered, and if so, can the engineering be reversed, has never received the full attention of the scientific establishment. Tonight, we're not asking you to abandon critical thinking. We're asking you to apply it more broadly, to take the convergence between the oldest texts and the newest science and treat it as a hypothesis worth investigating. Not a conclusion to be accepted, but a direction to be explored. The tablets are there, the genome is there, the tools to connect them are here. What has been missing is the willingness to ask the question. Perhaps that willingness is itself one of the dormant traits beginning to stir. One of the most overlooked aspects of the Sumerian creation texts is their tone. They are not triumphant. They are not celebratory. The creation of humanity is not presented as a glorious achievement. It is presented with ambivalence, with sorrow, with a kind of guilty resignation. When Nintu creates the first humans and sees that they are limited, she weeps. When Enki participates in the design and then immediately begins trying to undo the restrictions, his behavior reads not as divine caprice but as regret. When the flood comes and the mother goddess sees humanity drowning, she wails in anguish, the great goddess herself weeping as the waters rise. These are not the reactions of indifferent creators. These are the reactions of beings who know what they have done, who understand the moral weight of creating a conscious being and then deliberately diminishing it. The tablets are not a boast, they are a confession, and embedded within that confession is a promise. The knowledge is preserved, the tools are left behind, the door is left ajar. Enki always leaves the door ajar. If you read the text this way, the entire history of human civilization is not a random walk from primitivity to technology. It is a guided return, a slow, painful, generation-by-generation journey back to something that was always meant to be reclaimed. Gilgamesh, the first human who refused to accept the limit. No discussion of the Sumerian understanding of human limitation is complete without Gilgamesh, the great king of Uruk, 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, who undertook the longest journey in ancient literature for one purpose, to defeat death. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest surviving work of narrative literature on Earth. It dates to approximately 2100 BCE in its earliest Sumerian poems, with the most complete version, the standard Babylonian edition, compiled around 1200 BCE. And at its core, it is a story about a man who refuses to accept the limitations imposed on his species. Gilgamesh is not ordinary. Born of the goddess Ninsun and the mortal king Lugalbanda, he possesses extraordinary strength, beauty, and intelligence. He builds the great walls of Uruk. He defeats the monster Humbaba in the cedar forest. He rejects the advances of Ishtar herself. He is, in every measurable way, more than human. But he is mortal, and when his companion Enkidu dies, struck down by the gods as punishment for their heroic defiance, Gilgamesh confronts for the first time the reality of his own death, and he cannot accept it. He sets out on a quest that takes him to the ends of the earth. He crosses the waters of death. He finds Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, the one mortal who was granted immortality by the gods after the flood, and he asks the question that every human being has ever asked: how can I live forever? Utnapishtim tells him that immortality was granted to him alone, by divine decree, and cannot be replicated. But he offers Gilgamesh one chance, a test. If Gilgamesh can stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, he will prove himself worthy. Gilgamesh tries, and he falls asleep almost immediately. His body betrays him. The limitation is in his biology, not in his will. As a consolation, Utnapishtim's wife convinces her husband to tell Gilgamesh about a plant at the bottom of the sea, a plant called the Old Man Becomes Young. Gilgamesh dives to the ocean floor, retrieves the plant and begins his journey home. He does not eat it immediately. He wants to bring it back to Uruk to test it first on an elder to see if it works, and then, while he is bathing in a cool pool during his journey home, imagine him there, the greatest king in the world, waist-deep in still water, the plant resting on the bank beside his clothes. A serpent rises from the pool. It smells the fragrance of the plant. It takes it, and it sheds its skin, regenerating, becoming new, and vanishes into the reeds. And Gilgamesh sits down on the bank naked and dripping and weeps. This scene is one of the most devastating in world literature. The plant of rejuvenation, the biological mechanism for restoring youth, exists. It is real. It is within reach, but it is taken away, not by a god, not by an enemy, by a serpent. A creature that already possesses regenerative ability, a creature that can shed its own skin and emerge renewed. The symbolism is layered beyond measure. The serpent in Sumerian iconography is often associated with Enki, the god of wisdom and water, whose symbol includes intertwined serpents. This image was later inherited by Greek tradition in the form of the caduceus. And while drawing a direct line from ancient serpent symbolism to the structure of DNA would be a leap, the visual resonance between intertwined serpents and the double helix is, at minimum, a striking coincidence that has not escaped the notice of those who study these traditions. Gilgamesh loses the plant of life to the serpent, to the symbol of the DNA helix, to the symbol of the very god who engineered humanity's limitation in the first place. Is this coincidence? Is it poetic license by an ancient storyteller? Or could it be something else? A message, perhaps encoded in narrative, about the location of the secret that Gilgamesh sought? If we follow this thread of interpretation, the secret was never in a plant at the bottom of the sea. It was in the serpent itself, in the double helix, in the code. Gilgamesh fails in his quest because he looks outside himself for something that is inside. The answer was always in the biology, in the genome, in the 98% that no one thought to look at until 4,000 years later. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not just the first great work of literature, it is the first record of a human being who intuited that the limitation was artificial and who spent his life trying to overcome it. He did not succeed. But the fact that the story was written, preserved, copied, and transmitted across 3,000 years suggests that the aspiration itself was considered sacred. The drive to transcend the limit is, according to the tablets, the most human thing about us. It is the divine spark that could not be extinguished, the echo of the slain god's intelligence still resonating in the clay. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight, from the sterile laboratories of genome research to the dust-caked archives of Mesopotamia, from telomeres to clay tablets, from DNA methylation to the weeping of a mother goddess. The pattern we have traced is not proof. Let that be said clearly and without reservation. No one can point to a specific gene and say with certainty that the Anunnaki silenced it. No one can take a passage from the Atrahasis epic and match it, nucleotide by nucleotide, to a segment of chromosome 17. The 7 themes we have explored tonight are an interpretive framework, drawn from careful reading of multiple ancient texts and set alongside modern biological findings, not a catalogue etched into any single tablet. But patterns matter, convergences matter. When the oldest written records on Earth describe a process, the deliberate limitation of a created being, and the newest science on Earth discovers that the human genome contains vast regions of silenced potential, the correspondence deserves attention, not blind belief. Attention. The human genome contains 3 billion base pairs. Of those, roughly 1 to 2% code for proteins. The rest, the vast, silent, mysterious majority, contains regulatory sequences, transposable elements, pseudogenes, satellite DNA, ancient retroviral insertions, and structures that science is only beginning to categorize, let alone understand. We are walking through a library. The books are on the shelves. The pages are intact, but most of the volumes are locked behind glass. We can see the spines. We can read the titles, but we cannot yet open them. The Sumerians said the locks were placed there by gods. Science says the locks are epigenetic modifications accumulated over evolutionary time. The locks are real either way, and the books are still there. What changes everything is the discovery that the locks are not permanent. They can be picked, they can be dissolved, they can be reversed by chemicals, by drugs, by lifestyle, by meditation, by intention, and by technologies that did not exist 10 years ago. The Sumerian creation story is, at its core, a story about potential. Not lost potential, dormant potential. The difference matters. What is lost cannot be recovered. What is dormant can be awakened. What Enki left behind. We have already traced the paradox of Enki, the god who builds the cage and hides the key inside it. But there is a dimension to his legacy that we have not yet explored, and it begins with a place. Eridu, the first city, the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in Mesopotamia, located in what is now Tel Abu Sharain in southern Iraq. If you could stand there today, you would see almost nothing. A low mound in the desert, dust and silence. But beneath that mound lies something extraordinary. When archaeologists excavated the site in the 1940s and 1950s, a team led by Fouad Safar and Seaton Lloyd for the Iraqi Directorate of Antiquities, they found 18 distinct layers of temple construction, one built atop the other, stretching from approximately 5,400 BCE to the late 3rd millennium. Dig down through the sand, and you descend through time, each layer older than the last, each temple slightly smaller, slightly rougher, slightly closer to the beginning. At the very bottom, beneath 7,000 years of accumulated civilization, was a small sand brick structure barely 3 meters square, a room the size of a garden shed, the first temple ever built. By the topmost layer, the temple had grown into a monumental ziggurat rising above the plain. This was the Abzu, the house of the Abzu, Enki's temple, and it sat in the city that every Sumerian text identifies as the birthplace of civilization itself. The progression from tiny shrine to towering ziggurat, layer by layer, reads like a physical record of the Sumerians' own understanding of how knowledge accumulates. Slowly, incrementally, each generation building upon the foundation of the last. Enki's restorations follow the same logic. Writing was the first gift returned. With writing, humanity could store information outside the body, bypassing the limitation on ancestral memory. Mathematics was the second. With mathematics, humanity could model the cosmos, bypassing the limitation on cosmic awareness. Medicine was the third. With medicine, humanity could extend its lifespan and heal injuries, partially overcoming the limitations on longevity and regeneration. Each restoration enabled the next. Writing made mathematics possible. Mathematics made astronomy possible. Astronomy made navigation possible. Navigation made trade possible. Trade made cities possible. Cities made specialization possible. Specialization made science possible. Science made genetics possible. And genetics, at last, made it possible to read the code itself. Enki, if we follow this reading, did not leave a single key. He left a sequence, a ladder, and we have been climbing it, rung by rung, for 5,000 years. The temple at Eridu, growing layer by layer from a 3-meter room to a ziggurat, is perhaps the most literal image of that ascent preserved anywhere on Earth. There is a philosophical dimension to this story that we should not rush past, because if even a fraction of what we have discussed tonight is accurate, if the human being is indeed a deliberately limited version of a more capable template, then the implications extend far beyond biology. They reach into the deepest questions of identity. Who are you? Not your name, not your occupation, not the story you tell about yourself at dinner parties. Who are you at the level of the genome, at the level of the code? If 98% of your DNA is non-coding, if the vast majority of the information system that defines your physical existence is currently silent, then the person you experience yourself as is, in a very real sense, a fraction of what you actually are. You are the 2% that is currently expressed. The 98% that is silent is also you. It is just you in a dormant state. This reframes the entire question of human potential. The self-help industry tells you that you can become more through effort, through learning, through discipline, through positive thinking, and that is true as far as it goes. But what if the ceiling you're pushing against is not a ceiling of effort, but a ceiling of activation? What if the limitation is not in what you know or what you do, but in what portions of your genome are running? Athletes push the boundaries of physical performance. Meditators push the boundaries of conscious awareness. Scientists push the boundaries of intellectual understanding. But what if all of these pursuits are at their deepest level, pressing against the same wall, the epigenetic wall that separates the expressed genome from the dormant genome? Every human culture has a concept of awakening, enlightenment, satori, moksha, the born-again experience. The language varies, the cultural trappings are different, but the core experience is remarkably consistent across traditions, a sudden or gradual expansion of awareness in which the individual perceives themselves and the world with a clarity and depth that their previous state did not allow, as though a veil had been lifted, as though a dimmer switch had been turned up. What if awakening in every tradition is describing the same biological event, the partial reactivation of epigenetically silenced genes? What if the mystical experience is the subjective correlate of a molecular process that is happening in the non-coding regions of the genome? This is not reductionism. This is integration. The spiritual and the biological are not in opposition. They may be two descriptions of the same phenomenon, the slow, difficult, achingly beautiful process of a limited being remembering what it was before the limits were imposed. The Sumerians had a term, nam, ulu, that referred to the condition of being human, but in certain contexts, particularly in wisdom literature, the concept carried an aspirational dimension, not merely what humans are, but what they might become. The boundary between human limitation and divine capability was, for the Sumerians, not fixed. It was a question. We are not there yet. But the fact that we are having this conversation, that we can even formulate the question, suggests we are closer than any generation before us. So here we are, at the far end of a journey that began in the mud of southern Mesopotamia and ends, for now, in the fluorescent glow of a genetics laboratory. We have walked through 7 silences, 7 places where the oldest texts describe a door being closed, and where the newest science has found behind each door machinery that still works, still hums, still waits. Let us sit with what this means, not in the abstract, but for you, right now, in the body you are inhabiting as you listen to these words. Inside every cell of that body, and there are roughly 37 trillion of them, sits a copy of your genome, 3 billion base pairs of information. And of that vast library, the portion you are currently using is a fraction of the whole. The rest is there, organized, structured, layered with ancient viral sequences, regulatory switches, satellite arrays, and architectures that science mapped completely for the first time only in 2022. Some of it is genuinely non-functional, evolutionary debris as the early geneticists suspected. But some of it, and the question of how much remains one of the great open problems in biology, is functional but silent, active but muted, present but waiting. Think about what a caterpillar contains inside its cocoon. When it dissolves, when its body literally liquefies, the resulting soup contains structures called imaginal discs. These are clusters of cells that carry the blueprint for a completely different organism. They were always inside the caterpillar from the day it hatched, but they remained small, quiet, waiting, while the caterpillar body dominated. It is only when the caterpillar enters the cocoon, when the old structure breaks down completely, that the imaginal discs begin to take over. They reorganize, they differentiate, they form networks, and from those networks, an entirely new creature emerges, not a better caterpillar, a butterfly. A being that can do things the caterpillar could never do. It can fly, it can see ultraviolet light, it can navigate by the sun and the magnetic field. It is, in every meaningful sense, a different organism, built from the same DNA, but expressing an entirely different set of genes. The blueprint for the butterfly was always in the caterpillar's genome. It was just waiting for the right conditions to express. What if you are the caterpillar? What if the 7 silence themes we have explored are like those imaginal discs, dormant blueprints for a form of human being that has never yet fully emerged? What if the cocoon is this moment in history, this extraordinary convergence of ancient knowledge and modern science, of spiritual tradition and molecular biology, of crisis and opportunity? We cannot know for certain. We do not have proof. What we have is a pattern, a convergence of evidence from sources separated by 4,000 years and half a world, that points toward a single, breathtaking possibility. You are not finished. You are not what you were made to be. You are what you were made to become, and the becoming has not ended. It may, in fact, be accelerating. Every child born into this era inherits not only the genome of its parents, but the accumulated epigenetic legacy of a species that has been pushing against its own boundaries for 10,000 years. Every generation that meditates, that creates, that seeks knowledge, that pushes the frontiers of science and consciousness, every generation leaves its mark on the epigenome, and the next generation starts from a slightly higher floor. Every spiritual tradition on Earth, in its own way, has been pressing against the epigenetic locks on the silent genome. Some have found ways to crack them open, if only for a moment, if only for a flash. And now, for the first time in recorded history, we have the scientific language to understand what those traditions were doing all along. But here is what I want you to carry with you as you settle into the rest of this night. Nothing was deleted. The architecture is intact, and the silencing mechanisms, the methyl groups, the histone modifications, the chromatin compaction, are reversible. Science has demonstrated this. In the laboratory, in clinical trials, in living human cells, what was turned off can be turned back on. The Sumerians knew this. That is why they preserved the story. Not as entertainment, not as myth for its own sake, but as a message, a record of what was done, and an encoded assurance that it could be undone. Enki left the door open. He always left the door open. And the fact that you are here tonight, listening to these words, following this thread, asking these questions, suggests that you are already closer to that door than you realize. The night is long. Let these ideas settle. Do not force them into any framework. Do not rush to conclude. Just let them rest beside you, the way ancient tablets rested in the earth for thousands of years, silent, patient, waiting for the right moment to be read. Your body is relaxing now. Your breathing is slowing. The thoughts are softening at the edges, becoming more fluid, more open. This is good. This is natural. Let it happen. Somewhere inside you, beneath the noise of the day, beneath the worries and the plans and the obligations, somewhere deep in the quiet architecture of your cells, there is a library. It has been closed for a very long time. The books are dusty. The shelves are deep. The corridors are dark. But the library is not abandoned. It has a custodian, a consciousness that has been keeping watch, generation after generation, waiting for someone to walk through the door. That custodian is the part of you that is listening right now. The part that felt something when the word dormant was spoken. The part that recognized in the convergence between cuneiform and chromosomes something that was not new, but remembered. You are that library. You are the books and the reader. You are the code and the consciousness that interprets it. You are the lock and the key. Perhaps tonight, in the space between waking and sleep, you will hear the whisper of something ancient, something that has been waiting, with extraordinary patience for you to remember. Not what you were taught to be, but what you were designed to become. If this story stayed with you, if something in it resonated, even quietly, a like helps others find their way here too. And if you are not ready for sleep just yet, the next journey is waiting in the playlist. There is always more to explore. I would love to hear what stayed with you. Leave a thought in the comments. What you noticed, what you questioned, what you dreamed. Every conversation here is part of the same slow awakening. Until next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, sleep well and dream deep. Good night.